Okay, developing a biblical cosmology. First of all, I need to answer the question, what is cosmology? It comes from two words, Greek words, cosmos, meaning the world, or the big picture of everything, and logos, literally meaning the word, which we've kind of generalized to mean the study of. So it's a study of the world or study of the universe. Now today we generally think of cosmology as being the big picture, the structure of the universe as a whole, but in the past people could argue more restricted forms of that. For instance, the geocentric model, the idea that the earth is the center of everything, that is a cosmology. The heliocentric model, that the sun is the center of the solar system, that too is a cosmology. Furthermore, there is a related word called cosmogony, and cosmogony is technically the study of the history and the origin of the universe. And much of what today is passed off as cosmology technically is cosmogony. Particularly, I'm talking about the Big Bang model. It's called a cosmology, but technically it's a cosmology. But technically it's a cosmogony, calls a cosmology many times, but I'm not going to argue the point anymore. I'll just say it's a cosmology and be done with it. All right, many Christians today accept the Big Bang, and I disagree with that assessment for a number of reasons. I may share some of those with you here. What is the Big Bang? Well, it's the belief that the universe suddenly appeared 13.8 billion years ago. When I say the universe, I mean that, the totality of everything. And it's not just matter and energy that suddenly appeared. It's the appearance suddenly of matter, energy, space, and even time. Wrap your head around that, space and time. People sometimes will ask, well, what was here before the Big Bang? Well, that's really an improper question because here kind of denotes that there was space. And before kind of denotes that there was time, but neither one existed then. So I used to tell my students that here wasn't here then, and then wasn't then either. So it doesn't make any sense to ask that question, but of course we're going to ask that question anyway, I'm sure. But if you really understand the Big Bang model, it is a sudden appearance of energy, matter, space, and time all together coming into existence. And so, before the Big Bang, as it were, there was absolutely nothing. And if I ask all of you to close your eyes and get very zen and think about nothingness, most of you would probably think of empty space. But can't do that because space is a something. So to have truly nothing, you must have something less than nothing in that respect. Now, I know this sounds like double talk and stuff, but that's the kind of things we talk about in cosmology and these things. It really is mind-altering without any kind of side effects. All right, though it can be habit-forming. Okay, the universe suddenly appears, and then that appearance is of one where the universe is initially much smaller than today, and it's very hot and it's very dense. And it's a type of gas, but it's not kind of gas we're familiar with because the densities and temperatures are off the charts. Normal matter, as we know it, can't exist. You maybe have quarks and stuff existing, but you don't have protons and neutrons yet. As it expands, and by the way, it starts off expanding that way. I've often wondered, does it have to start off that way? And I don't know the answer to that according to general relativity, but everybody assumes that it starts off that way. And of course, as it expands, it cools. And as it cools, it allows the quarks then to come together to form protons and neutrons, and eventually they form atoms, and away you go. And after billions of years of expanding and cooling, the universe we see today is the result of all of this. Now, it's not without problems, and the problems I mean right here are the problems for Christians. The very first question that comes up is the matter of time. It started off 13.8 billion years ago. And I don't believe Scripture allows for that kind of time to have existed in the past. Also, you have other issues coming up. Stars existing before the Earth. The Earth appears really very early on in the creation account, but stars are Johnny-come-latelys on day 4. So the Earth is at least a few days older than the stars are, but according to the Big Bang, stars begin to form within 1 billion years after the Big Bang, and that means that there were stars forming for more than 8, almost 9 billion years before the Earth even showed up. That's a problem biblically, and there are other problems as well. And there's difficulties along the line here, so I reject this approach of saying this. Some people want to read Genesis 1:1 to say, in the beginning, 13.8 billion years ago, God created the heavens and the earth with a Big Bang. That's the way they try to read Genesis 1:1, which is, of course, rolling all over the text big time. So I would like, if I reject the Big Bang, you may ask me, well, what kind of cosmology do you have? And for many, many years, I didn't have one. But today I'm happy to report that I now sort of have a cosmology developing, and I couldn't be more happy about that. Let's examine the biblical evidence to see what I'm talking about. Okay, Genesis 1:1 gets started, and the very first verse says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And that seems, I think I'm quoting from the ESV here, and that seems a pretty straightforward sort of statement. What does it mean that God created the heavens and the earth? Well, many creationists, myself included for many years, thought that the creation of the heavens there referred to space itself, space and time. So you have space and time being mentioned very first here with the earth being created, and then you go on from there. Tuck that away for future reference in this talk. All right, then we come to day 2, and God made this thing that's in the King James is firmament. In a lot of modern translations, it's expanse, and I understand in the Hebrew the word is rakia. Is that okay? Okay. We've got a Hebraist in the audience, and I'm always intimidated that I'm going to mispronounce these words, so I hope you'll be kind to me here. I'll try to, as much as I can when I say rakia. I love that word, though. I know it's not rakia, so I'll refrain from saying it that way. So that's what you have on day 2. All right, tuck that away for future reference. More specifically, let's look at Genesis 1:6 through 8, the entirety of the day 2 account, and I will go ahead and read it in English as it appears in the ESV. And he says there in those 3 verses, and God said, let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters. And God made the expanse, and separated the waters that were under the expanse from the waters that were above the expanse. And it was so. And God called the expanse heaven, and there was evening, and there was morning, the second day. All right. Whenever you see the word expanse there, realize in the King James it's going to say firmament. And also, when it's in the Hebrew, it's going to say rakia at that point. So the word's used several times there in the day 2 account in its entirety. Now, notice also that in verse 8, it says that God called the expanse heaven. The Hebrew word there is shemayim, and it's equating those two. Whatever this expanse or rakia is that he made on day 2, God calls it explicitly heaven at that point. Makes an equation between rakia and shemayim on that day 2. That's important. Note a few things then. Number 1, all I've talked about so far is day 1 and day 2. This thing that God made on day 2 is separated the waters. And I read this in the King James when I started getting into science and creation science back in high school many years ago. I read through this several times trying to make sense, and I read the firmament in the King James. It's all I had at the time. And I looked at it and I thought, what is this thing? That really baffled me and bothered me. And its purpose seemed to be separating waters. Now, it makes sense because, well, we have separation of waters on the surface of the earth, but hold on a minute. Number 1, that separation horizontally comes to ray on day 3, not on day 2. It talks about vertical. Number 2, a vertical separation of waters above and waters below. So whatever this thing is that he makes on day 2, there's water up above it, apparently. Water below it. So if you want to figure out what this rakia is on day 2, you're going to have to deal with the issue of what the waters above are. And if you decide what the waters above are before deciding what the rakia is, it will dictate what that rakia is, won't it? On the other hand, if you identify the rakia first, it will then identify what the waters above are. And I think too many people have tried to identify the waters first and then try to use that to figure out what that expanse was. I think that's looking at it all wrong. I think the expanse is mentioned first. Maybe you ought to start with it. Also note, I'm dealing with days 1 and 2 here. I haven't talked about day 4, and that's when the stars came in. So whatever this thing is, the stars aren't involved yet. In fact, none of the astronomical bodies are involved yet. They don't come around until day 4, 3 days after this, or 2 days after this, excuse me. Also notice that the very first verse says that God, in the beginning, created the heavens and the earth. And then in verse 8, it says, after he makes this expanse, God called this expanse heaven. And that seems to put us in the curious position of God creating heaven twice, doesn't it? If you think he made it on verse 1, then he made it again on day 2. And that bothered me. I thought, well, wait a minute, God, I don't think he made this thing twice. I think he made it once, whatever it is. And that's problematic for me here. Okay, the the English word in the King James firmament, again, it comes from that word rakia, and it occurs 17 times in the Old Testament. That's not a lot of occurrences, but many times with words, if you're not sure what it means in one passage, it helps to go to other passages and see how it's used in those other passages. And that'll help you out. That's good. Except over half of the occurrences, 9 of them occur in Genesis 1 alone. And I think it's talking about the same thing each time it does. So obviously over half the occurrences are not available to you, because if you don't know what it is in verses 6, 7, and 8, you probably don't know what it is when it's mentioned elsewhere in that first chapter. Well, you could go to the other 8 occurrences, but some of those are problematic. In the Psalms, I think it's talking about the same thing here. Once in Daniel, I'm not so sure it is talking about it. When you get to Ezekiel, however, I'm thoroughly convinced it's talking about something totally different. I don't know about you, but I'm really uncomfortable trying to go to the Psalms to try to figure out what something means. I think it's bad form to build a teaching based almost entirely upon what comes out of the Psalms. They're good for amplification and reinforcement. It's not so good for deducing what the meaning is many times. You've got to be very careful about that. Okay, it's kind of striking out on this one as far as help is concerned. But heaven is a different story. The Hebrew word there is shemayim. And it occurs 420 times in the Old Testament, and most of those, 398 in the King James at least, it's translated heaven or heavens. Notice it's singular or plural. Well, which one is it? Well, if you know anything at all about Hebrew, and I don't know that much, but I do know people who do know Hebrew, and I listen to them a lot, that I-am ending on the back of shemayim tells you it's a plural word. Okay, that's good, except there is no singular form for it. That's kind of odd, but then we have a few words in English that are like that. Deer, for instance. You can have one deer, you can have 2 or more deer, right? And that's nice. You can usually figure out how many deer you're talking about. It's either plural or singular. How do you do that? Well, the words around it, the articles you choose, like if you say that deer or a deer, it's pretty clear that it's one. If you say the deer, it may refer to probably a bunch of them. Even better if it's got a number attached to it, like I shot 2 deer, then you know it's 2 or more. If it's the subject of a sentence, it really helps. You know, the deer did whatever, and you can use the plural or singular form, and that will help you quite a bit on figuring that out, which is meant here. But unfortunately, the word shemayim only occurs as the subject of a sentence a couple of times. It's the object a lot, and so the verb doesn't help you too much here. But those couple occurrences, when it does, it really helps you out at that point. Turns out in the day, Genesis 1, it occurs in the objective, not the subjective sense, so it's of no help. And in Hebrew, it doesn't matter. In English, it does. And if you look at the very first verse, sometimes some passages, some Bibles say heaven singular, some say heavens plural. Which one's right? I don't know. Okay, it comes down as simple as that. Not a lot of help here yet. Then you go to the day 4 account, and that's where it starts appearing again. It says in verse 14, just a part of the phrase there, it's talking about God creating these lights and the luminaries in the heavens. He says, let there be lights in the expanse of the heaven, or if you will, the rakia of the shemayim. So it's telling us he's going to put these lights in this thing, and it puts expanse of heaven, or rakia of shemayim again. Why is it put together that way? Those 2 words with a preposition in between. I think it's reinforcing the idea that whatever this is, it's talking about the same thing he made on day 2. I think that's the significance of that. But it's even better than that. It repeats it in verse 15. Their location, again, is in that expanse of heavens, the same exact construct that appeared in verse 14. And we're not done yet, because in verse 17, it uses the same thing. God set them in the expanse of the heavens. Now, when he says it 3 times, maybe it's for emphasis. I don't know, but that seems to get my attention. And again, I think the fact that he puts shemayim and rakia together, and I think it's suggesting very strongly that lest there be any doubt, it's talking about the same thing. that was being talked about in the day 2 account. And notice the context here is telling you that's where the stars are. That's where the heavenly bodies, the sun and the moon. So whatever this thing is, it's where the heavenly bodies or the astronomical bodies seem to be put. And that's very important, I think. Now, that same phrase is mentioned another time in the day 5 account, talking about the birds. And it says there in verse 20 of chapter 1, and God said, let the waters swarm with swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly across the earth, across the expanse of the heavens. And again, you see that same terminology, expanse of the heavens, or rakia of the Shemayim, and people say, well, it's talking about the exact same thing. Okay, so wherever this is, that's where the birds are. But hold on a minute. I've put in bold there the entire context. Not only do you have the expanse of the heavens, but you also have this word across in the ESV. It didn't appear in the day 4 account at all. I think James is the cross of heavens, and indeed you find it expressed different ways in different versions. Now again, I'm no Hebrew scholar, not even a Hebrew student, but I've talked to people, and it turns out this, I understand, is a little difficult to translate in just 1 or 2 words. It takes a bit more fleshing in on that. But as I understand this, you've got this rachia sitting there where the heavenly bodies are, and the actual thing that's getting across is the birds are flying across this near side of it, or the face of this side of it. It's got some depth to it, but they're not very far into it. They're just kind of on this nearest edge of this thing. That's what's trying to get across with this unusual, sort of difficult to translate succinctly wording at this point. So there's a relationship between where the birds are, but there's also to where the heavenly bodies are, but it's not exactly an equation of the same thing, suggesting to me that perhaps where the birds are and where the heavenly bodies are not exactly the same thing. They're closely related, but not exactly the same thing. Now, Psalm 19:1 is one of the cleanest places where it's mentioned. I've got it here in the ESV, and I don't like this particular one because they changed the word rakia. Instead of having it expanse, they have it as sky, which is, by the way, not a bad translation, but it's not consistent with what I see elsewhere. But maybe what I'll do is I'll just try to quote it as, substituting in the King James words. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament above proclaims his handiwork. Notice that with this word have bold-faced them in each one of those. I've got the pointer here. I've bold-faced the heavens there. That is the word what? Anybody remember? Shemayim. And this word here is rakia. Now notice this is from the Psalms, which is poetry. And there are certain elements of ancient Hebrew poetry, very unlike modern English poetry. I should say English poetry. We work off of meter and rhyme and all these kinds of things, but that's not really showing up, at least not in the English translations of ancient Hebrew poetry. They work off of parallels and contrasts. You find these a lot in the Proverbs, for instance. The wise man does this, but the fool does that. Or you would say it, that's a contrast. So you say it positively, you say it negatively, kind of the opposite. Sometimes you end up with parallel structures. You know, you do this and you do that. It's the same thing being said, just saying in different ways. I would submit to you that's what we have here. We have a parallelism between these two phrases making up this single verse. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament proclaims his handiwork. It's saying the same thing, isn't it? More or less, just saying it differently. But that parallel structure only works if there's an equation between the Shemayim and the rakia. That parallelism only works if these are the same entities being talked about there. Now this reinforces what I've deduced from chapter 1 of Genesis, because in verse 8, God explicitly equates the heavens with the rakia, and so that reinforces that idea very nicely. Furthermore, if you go into Psalm 19, you will find in verses 4 and so there's equation of the two. You get up to verses 4 through 6, and this clearly places a sun. One of the heavenly bodies, one of the luminaries God made on day 4, clearly places it in this thing it's talking about. It introduces this rakia, this Shemayim, and then it goes on in verses 4 through 6, talks about the sun, the tabernacle for the sun, moving in its circuit, and it's clearly in that same place. Having said all that, then I can reach a conclusion, at least about the rakia, I believe. I believe that rakia, or the expanse, is where the astronomical bodies are. Now, as you're going to find out in a moment here, it was a radical departure from me. And I'll go over where I came from and how I got here just a little bit. Now, this whole idea of what this idea of the rakia is has been bungled quite a bit for millennia and for centuries, and it's really had some bad consequences all the way around. We can go back and blame the Greeks for these things. You have here a model of what the Greeks thought the world was like. This is a model that I had in my labs back at the university when I taught, and before I left, I took a photograph of one of these things inside the lab. You've got this little globe inside that represents the Earth. You can see South America right there. And then a much larger globe outside. It's made out of hard plastic. You've got little yellow dots everywhere. Those little yellow dots represent stars. The little blue outlines represent the location, the outlines of constellations. You got other things. You got the sun up here, the moon you can move. You got a dial to move things around, a horizon plate, all that kind of stuff. And this is really quite a bit like the model the ancient Greeks had. They thought that the world was surrounded by this big sphere we call today the celestial sphere. It was clear and it was hard and had the stars impregnated in it. Does anybody believe this model today? I don't think there's a single person alive who does. But 2,000 years ago, they certainly did in the Greek world. So if nobody believes this, why do I have this in my lab? I used it in my instructions that I gave in astronomy. I've taken my class several times and I'm showing them things. I had 2 labs I wrote for my students to do little demonstrations with these things in the lab. Why did I use such a horribly flawed, false model in my teaching and in my labs? Well, because it's useful and we kind of pretend it works. And we still actually use terminology with this, like astronomers regularly talk about moonrise, moonset, sunrise, sunset. That's definitely following this kind of model, but none of us believe it. So that's just the schizoid world we live in. It doesn't bother me. It shouldn't bother you at all. Nobody teaches this as truth today, but in the past, people did. And the Hebrews, the Greeks had a word for this. They call it a stereoma. And a stereoma is something that's hard, and it's transparent, and it's firm. And the word appears in the New Testament. I think in Galatians it talks about being steadfast. That the word stereoma is the word actually used there. Well, when the Septuagint translators got to the word rakia, there in the 3rd century or so BC in Alexandria, they were steeped in Greek learning and culture. They saw that and they said, aha, this is that thing God made, because the stars you see are in it, and God made this stereoma on day 2, and he filled it with stars on day 4. So let's translate rakia as stereoma. A few centuries later, Jerome, he's living in the same world, now more Roman, I guess, but they still have Greek cosmology. He has no problem with this cosmology, and he doesn't want to go back and try to rethink the rakia, so he comes up with the translation as firmamentum in Latin, which then gets transliterated into English in early English translations as firmament. And that's where it comes from. And when I read firmament, I'm thinking of something hard like this. It's exactly what the Greeks would have said, but by the 20th century, nobody believed that anymore. So you've got an attempt here by the Septuagint translators 23 centuries ago to read into the text of Genesis the cosmology of their day. Does that sound familiar? Yeah. People today trying to repeat the same mistake with the Big Bang model, aren't they? And we, after 23 centuries, we're still living with the effects of that bad mistake. That ought to tell us something about the Big Bang, shouldn't it? And this got morphed even more. This is the famous Flammarion engraving. And this supposedly represents what the cosmology of the ancient world was, the cosmology of the Bible. You have the Old Testament, you have the flat earth sitting here, and you get a dome with stars in it and the sun and the moon. And some intrepid explorer has come over here and actually poked his hole in the edge of the earth, and he's looking out beyond, behind all the gears behind all of this. And of course, that represents the ancient cosmology and the medieval cosmology, and aren't you thankful that due to the effect of the Enlightenment, so-called, we got away from this sort of thing. And of course, this is a very ancient engraving. It goes all the way back to Flammarion's book, published in 1888. This was part of the hatchet job that the so-called Enlightenment did on the world. They had to run down the Middle Ages and call it the Dark Ages and everything. I am of the opinion that the so-called Enlightenment was the third greatest disaster to strike humanity. And I got a three-point sermon outlined with alliteration here, the three great disasters, knowing where the Enlightenment came from. You've got the fall, the flood, and France. All right, so that's your three-part outline for free that you can take and use all that you want here. This is nonsense. This is never taught by the church. It was never believed by the ancient Hebrews. Well, it was by some of them. It was never the cosmology of the Bible. People have tried to interpret the Bible in terms of that, and there's a whole talk I can give on that, but no time for that today. So we've had a lot of wrong ideas about this rakia going back at least to the 3rd century BC, trying to incorporate the cosmology of the day, and it's just been a disaster after disaster. We talk about the Ptolemaic model and all sorts of other things and the problems it gave us. But then in the 20th century, we find people trying to correct this and trying to fix this. And so the 20th century, a new approach was unleashed, and I don't know if it's original to the 20th century. In fact, the person who popularized it was Henry Morris, and he didn't actually even originate it, but he did popularize it. And he took the opinion that the heavens of day one was the creation of the space of the universe. When it says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, it says right there, the earth was created, and space as we know it was created. And by the way, the word space is of modern origin. It's not an old term. It's a fairly recent term. I'm not sure how far back it goes, but certainly in the last few centuries. But Henry Morris said that the heavens of day one is the creation of space as we know it. And I, too, held that opinion for quite a while. Well, if space is created on day one, and space is where astronomical bodies would be, and I just argued a few moments ago that I believe the thing made on day two, the rakia, is the location of heavenly bodies. That would make the rakia on day two space, would it not, in our modern parlance? So how did Henry Morris handle day two? Well, he said the expanse of day two is the Earth's atmosphere. Now let's go to a little bit of ancient Greek cosmology once again. They kind of divided things up. You had the first heaven, which was the atmosphere of the Earth, where the birds flew, where the clouds were, and the rain was. You had the second heaven, the astronomical heaven, and you have the third heaven, the abode of God above that. And many people think that that's the biblical cosmology. But the only allusion to that dichotomy or trichotomy of heavens is found once in the New Testament, where the Apostle Paul spoke about being up in the third heaven at one point. Now, does that mean then that that's God's cosmology or the Bible, cosmology of the Bible? Well, no. Paul was an educated man. He was a Jew of the Jews, but at the same time, he also was a Roman citizen. I think he was educated probably in Greek thinking. And he was probably expressing what he had gone through, which is hard to describe, in terms of what he and his readers and listeners would have probably understood. And so he used a Greek concept, not necessarily endorsing it. That happens a lot in the New Testament, with people mentioning things without necessarily endorsing those things. So you've got to be careful. People say, aha, this is the cosmology of the Bible. I don't think it necessarily is. It might be, but let's don't be too dogmatic about that point. So what Henry Morris said was, well, there are two other heavens, the atmospheric and the astronomical, so let's do it this way. Day one is astronomical heaven, day two is the Earth's atmosphere. Now right away a problem arises there because he would argue, remember I talked about the difference between the day 5 and the day 4 account of this construction there about expanse of the heaven there and firmament of heaven. And it seems to me he kind of flipped this completely around. He was trying to take the across the face of, or the open firmament of heaven of day 5, and making that sound like that was what was made on day 2, and the stars merely appeared to be in that heaven, but they really aren't. And I think really he got it completely backwards. I think it's the birds that appear to be there, and the stars are actually there, the astronomical bodies. So he gets it backwards from what I think is the proper approach to it. Now, why did he do that? Well, I think it was to help support the canopy model. Again, he did not originate it, but he certainly popularized it, and it made most of us believe in it for a number of years. The canopy model is this idea that there was water surrounding, in some form, surrounding the Earth. It says vapor here, but I think you'd have to really believe it had to be water if this is the case. And this water canopy above the Earth's atmosphere, you see if the thing made on day 2 is the Earth's atmosphere, then you have to believe there was water above that atmosphere. And supposedly it blocked out a lot of harmful radiation coming into the Earth, allowing us to see things nevertheless. And this supposedly explained a host of different things, like the fact that there was no rain before the flood, no rainbows before the flood, and people lived to be great ages, and this harmful radiation was blocked out. Well, hold on a minute. Does the Bible really say it didn't rain before the flood? Not really. Does the Bible say there were no rainbows before the flood? Not really. And as far as longevity, well, we don't know why that happened exactly. That's one possible suggestion, but there are other reasons. In fact, divine intervention could be one of the better reasons for this. I think maybe the canopy model was trying to explain way too much. But he said the pre-flood world was very different in this respect beyond others before the flood. This thing collapsed at the time of the flood, and it helped to provide one of the 2 sources of water during the flood. The windows of heaven being open was this canopy collapsing, and then the other thing was the fountains of the great deep, ocean basins or other subterranean water coming up. Well, there's other problems with this I could mention, like for instance, I believe it's Psalm 148 says, praise ye waters above the heavens. Now Psalm 148, we don't know who wrote it, but it almost certainly was post-flood, and yet he's talking there as if those waters were still there, but if they precipitated during the flood, they couldn't possibly still be there. So if they were there in the psalmist's day, I think the waters may still be there as well. Well, this whole idea of the vapor canopy or the water canopy is largely rejected now for a number of reasons, some of the ones I've just mentioned, among others. So my question is, if we reject the canopy, shouldn't we go back and reevaluate the cosmology upon which the canopy stood? And apparently nobody has done that, or at least they haven't committed to print that I'm aware of. So I thought, well, that's amazing. We've got rid of the canopy, but we still keep thinking in terms of the cosmology upon which the canopy, quite literally in some respects, rested. So, straightforward reading, I think, of Genesis 1 is probably that this rakia, the expanse, the firmament, is space, and maybe by extension would include the inner part of that, which would be at least part of the atmosphere. Turns out this dichotomy between the atmosphere and space, we used to call it outer space, by the way, don't say outer space much anymore like we did in the 60s, but this dichotomy is fairly modern. Furthermore, it's a little fuzzy even today. Where does the atmosphere end and space begin? Well, I'm aware of at least 2 definitions. One is at a height of 50 miles. I understand if somebody from the United States acquires the altitude of at least 50 miles, like some X-15 pilots did, they are astronauts. Another standard is 100 kilometers, which is 62 miles. You see, the atmosphere just doesn't shut off at one point. The atmosphere thins out and thins out and thins out. And right now, I think we can clearly say we're in the atmosphere. The space station is clearly not. But where in between is the interface where one ends and one begins? And there is no clear statement of that. And so if there's no clear statement of that, it's arbitrary, then I'm not sure what part of the atmosphere, part of it or all of it, is part of that rakia. I have no problem with it all being that, the atmosphere and space as well. Anyway, if we take what I've deduced here, that space is largely what the rakia is, it leads me to 3 startling conclusions, and this is just, blows my socks off when I finally got my head wrapped around this a couple of years ago. First of all, it suggests that the universe has an edge to it, and that's anathema to modern cosmology. The universe cannot have an edge. Now, there's nothing wrong with it having an edge other than the fact that nobody likes it for that reason. I think there are a number of philosophical biases against it. Once you get past that, then it's pretty easy to having that. But if I suggest that to fellow astronomers, they look at me like, what? Are you out of your mind? But I think biblically it says it has an edge because it goes out there and it talks about this water separation, and it better have a finite edge to it someplace if you're going to have that water at that edge on there, which brings me to another point. This thing was kind of expanded outward from the earth And so that would suggest if it goes out somewhat symmetrically, doesn't have to be, but if it is, then that suggests that the universe probably has a center to it. Particularly if it has an edge to it, it probably has a center. And again, that's anathema to modern cosmology. Furthermore, if that thing was expanded outward somewhat symmetrically from the Earth, not only is there a center, but the Earth is somewhere near the center. Now, it's not required that it be, but I think that's kind of an implication that I'm getting. And that's really anathema, because you see, not only does, in modern cosmological terms, does the universe not have a center, but even if it did, as vast as the universe is, what's the probability we would be anywhere near the center? Vanishingly small. And so the atheistic mind or the materialistic, naturalistic mind is going to resist this to their dying breath. I'm certainly convinced of this. But this is the implication that I'm taking away from Scripture at this point. And then this is probably one of the wildest ones. Not only is there an edge, not only somewhere near the center, but at the edge there is water. Now some people may say, well, if it's out there and it's low pressure and it's low temperature, it can't possibly be water. It must have gone through a phase transition, so now that it's ice or that it's gas. And that's okay. Physically, that might be the case. But, you know, there's a problem. If the universe has an edge to it, I think physics is kind of off the table at that point. And I don't know what kind of physical conditions would prevail at that point. Furthermore, the word mayim, which means water, means liquid water. And we do the same thing today. If I say water to you, you're probably not going to think ice. If I say water, you're probably not going to think steam. And we recognize at some level that that is just a different form of water, but we have different words for those different forms, don't we? And that's the idea that it's just simply a solid water or gaseous water, that's a fairly modern concept. Furthermore, I understand that the ancient Hebrews had a couple of words. If you meant ice, you could use that word. If you meant steam, you could use that word. They didn't. They used the word mayim, which suggests that it's liquid water. Well, that's really mind-blowing as well. But water is also made of normal matter. We technically would say baryonic matter, which just means protons, neutrons, electrons, normal matter, as it were. And I would think by the third law of thermodynamics, its temperature probably, didn't know there's a third law, did you? The third law of thermodynamics would require, I believe, that the temperature be above absolute zero. I don't think it can be absolute zero. Well, there's a general understanding of physics out there. If you have baryonic matter, this is where my science is finally kicking in, the physics is finally kicking in. If you have baryonic matter that's above absolute zero, it must radiate. It must radiate. Now, since this is on the edge of the universe, I'm going to expect that this radiation is going to be turned inward. It's going to be radiating inward toward the inner parts of the universe. And so I would expect the radiation from this water layer out there would manifest itself as uniform radiation coming from all directions in space. Every direction you look, you're going to see water, and so you're going to see radiation coming from that water. Now, I also accept from astronomy, observational astronomy, that there's a thing called the Hubble relation, and that means the farther away something is, its spectrum is redshifted more and more and more, shifted towards longer wavelengths. Now, the most direct interpretation of that, the most simple interpretation, the most obvious interpretation is that the universe is expanding. And as a creationist, I don't have a problem with the universe expanding. Some of my creation brethren do. I don't care. They do accept the fact that the Hubble relation works, and so there should be increasing redshift at greater distance. If you want to explain it some other way, go at it. It has no bearing upon this. That means that the radiation that this thing gives off would be redshifted towards longer wavelengths. Now, objects like this, if it's in the liquid form, if there's any appreciable depth to it, I'm going to expect it to give off a particular type of spectrum. And that particular type of spectrum we call a black body spectrum. A black body spectrum. So the prediction is, based upon this biblical model I'm trying to develop here, is that we should have radiation from water in every direction in space. It has a certain characteristic black body curve. It's going to have a certain temperature associated with it, but because it's been redshifted by whatever's going on in the universe, then it should be at a fairly low temperature. So the prediction is, from my proposal here, that we should have this uniform radiation field of low temperature coming from every direction in space. Some of you are already figured out where I'm going with this, because that's exactly what we see. We call this the cosmic microwave background. This is a map of this, I think, from the I think this is from the Planck experiment, I believe. We've done it 3 times now from spacecraft. I always get the WMAP and the Planck confused when I see the plot of it. This is the entire sky. We have basically like the globe of the Earth, the equator's running through here and the poles are up here. So you're seeing the whole sky in there. And these little red and blue regions represent temperature variations in the background radiation. It's been much subject of discussion for the past 30 years or so, because you see back in 1948, one of the proponents of the Big Bang Theory suggested that in their model, there was a period of time when the universe was very hot, and we should be able to see the radiation field from it. And they weren't able to detect that for another 15 years, but they finally did in the early 60s. And in 1965, they published a paper where they said the universe is filled with this microwave radiation. They call it that because it's in the microwave part of the spectrum. And consequently, this was taken as proof of the Big Bang. And this is the primary reason why the Big Bang cosmogony has been the only game in town for a half century. By the way, it's the only evidence for the Big Bang. It was a prediction. They did experiment, it came out. Sometimes people will try to snow you by giving a whole list of proofs of the Big Bang or evidences for it. There aren't any, those are made up. This is the only one they have, and I have to confess to you, I'm impressed with it. And when people ask me, you don't believe in the Big Bang, well, how do you explain the CMB? And for much of the time, I'd have to say, I don't know. Well, now I have an explanation. And wouldn't you have loved it if maybe 75 years ago, somebody would have taken Genesis 2 very seriously? Because if they had, they might have been able to, with combining what little physics you need to add to it towards the end, to predict that there should be a cosmic microwave background. And we could have predicted that. Somebody could have predicted it before it was discovered. I was just a little kid at the time, so I can't be taken accountable for this. But somebody could have figured this out from Genesis and other scriptures alone. Sad that they did not. Okay, can we build upon this? I think we can. There are some features on here that show up. I want to point out 2 of them. This big bright bar running across right there, that's called the axis of evil. If you don't believe me, Google that. It will come up. Once you get past the axis of evil of the first President Bush, you'll get to the cosmic axis of evil. And they don't know what this is. They can explain other things, but they can't explain that one. That's a weird one. Can we explain that? Well, I don't know. Maybe we can. And by the way, this axis of evil is lined up with the Earth's orbit, Earth's orbit around the sun. It's close to the ecliptic. That's weird. And that has to be coincidence, you would think, but maybe not. Also, there's a little cold spot, actually a big cold spot right there. That's called the big cold spot down there. And nobody knows what that is either. So we got a couple of features on the, but you don't talk about it too much. We have 2 features on the CMB that maybe we can explain. Furthermore, if this is emission from liquid water, I would expect that there would be a couple of emission or actually probably some absorption features or emission features depending on the conditions. And those might be at the long wavelength end of this thing where nobody's looking. There might be some actual spectral features, but nobody looks at that part of the spectrum. One would have to kind of tweak this model and maybe quantify it just a little bit and make a prediction about what kind of spectral features. So there is a possibility here of explanatory power, of explaining these 2 oddities, and there's also the possibility of predictive power of what might lie in the spectrum of this thing. This model I'm suggesting is in its infancy, and it needs more work, and I probably need help for more work. I would like to direct my final words here to people in the room or people watching. If you're a young person, you have you love the Lord, you're looking for guidance in your life, what you should do with it, and you have aptitude and interest in science, I would suggest that you consider the possibility, prayerfully consider, entering science as your field. I made that decision as a sophomore in high school, and to be an astronomer for God's glory, and that's what I've been doing ever since then, in preparation and now in work. And it's been a wonderful career. I highly recommend it, and I'm looking for replacement people. So maybe you could take this and build on it and do something else with it. Well, thank you very much.